States must redraw the boundaries of their federal and state legislative districts every 10 years to reflect new population data generated from the census. In 2010, California voters took redistricting out of the hands of state legislators and gave it to an independent citizens commission. Now a case before the U.S. Supreme Court may give that power back to the legislature. Are the foxes about to return to the henhouse? And if that happens, how will it change California's political landscape? We'll find out from Citizens Redistricting Commissioner Stanley Forbes and KQED's senior editor on California politics and government, John Myers.
Additional funding for the Maddy Report made possible by a grant from Paramount Agricultural Companies, growing healthy food for you and your family.
From the California Channel at the State Capitol and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. In 2008 and 2010, California voters rejected political gerrymandering and gave a Citizens Redistricting Commission the authority to draw lines for California's state and congressional legislative districts. Our guest is a member of the Citizens Redistricting Commission, Commissioner Stanley Forbes. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thanks. I appreciate the chance to be here.
Okay, so redistricting sounds a little dry to a lot of folks. Why should we care?
Well, first of all, I would argue that it's really not dry, but in fact, I think we should care a lot, because if you think your vote matters, or you want your vote to matter, then how the lines are drawn, how things are set up, will affect the effectiveness of your vote. If the areas, the lines are gerrymandered, your vote can mean nothing.
So what is gerrymandering? You hear that word a lot. What is gerrymandering?
Well, gerrymandering is a process by which politicians draw their political lines for their districts in a way that ensures that they're going to get reelected, or their friends or their party are going to get reelected. And the lines pay no attention to what the public wants, where the public is. It just goes out and grabs voters that will help them achieve the purpose of getting the incumbent reelected.
So basically it's the legislators who select the voters and not the voters who select the legislators.
That's our line.
That's your line, okay. I have heard that line before.
I mean, exactly. It's a line that we came up early in the process. I mean, we don't want the politicians to select their voters. We want the voters to select their politicians.
Yeah. So the Commission's done a lot of work. I was wondering if you could walk us through the Commission's redistricting process. Who's on the Commission? Mm-hmm. What criteria did they follow when they came up with the lines for the districts?
Sure. Once the voters approved the 2008 Prop 11, which created the ability to draw the lines for the state legislature, and then 2010, which are the congressional lines, okay, something in excess of 30,000 people applied. And we went through a vetting process. We had a letter of recommendation. They checked all our finances. We had to write essays. We had personal interviews. And it got winnowed down to 14 people, of which 5 are Democrats, 5 are Republicans, and 4 are from not the 2 major parties as the official language, largely declined to state. Mm-hmm. We then held hearings throughout the state. We held well over 100 hearings in the space of 3 or 4 months. We had over 2,700 people come and speak to us. We had over 20,000 public comments. Everything was done live. We had no other meetings outside of the public eye. Everything was transcribed. It was completely transparent. And then we got together for a month here in Sacramento at McGeorge Law School and spent a month drawing lines. And the public had input, and
it was a complicated process.
It was and it was intense.
And it took up, I mean, when you were doing that for that month, I mean, was that a lot of time? I mean, every day?
Well, let me give you an example. For the 8 months from January 1st until August 15th, which is when the maps are certified by the Secretary of State, I took 1 day off, and I was not atypical. I mean, it was an everyday deal all the time.
I remember when we first talked about this a few years ago, you were saying you were excited about the process. I was wondering, after you'd gone through that process, it was so intense, if you still felt the same way.
Oh, absolutely, and I think we all did. I mean, there was a real band of brothers feeling for the whole commission about the process.
What was some of the criteria that you used when you came up with the decision to draw the lines?
Well, the Prop 11 set the criteria. We had to be 1 person, 1 vote. We had to have them contiguous. The critical one, really, we had to comply with the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act. The one that we got most public testimony about, though, was communities of interest. which was a very interesting process.
Yeah, that's an interesting term, communities of interest. I mean, what does that mean?
Well, I mean, and there was a lot of discussion about what that meant, and then should there have been consistent standards, because it was pretty much of a whatever we wanted it to be. And I think it's good not to have a specific definition. I think we felt this as a commission, because the state is so diverse. We needed the people to tell us what their community of interest was, because the community of interest up in Modoc County is not the same as in inner city Los Angeles. And we drew a draft map, and we made basically some mistakes. So we misunderstood what the community of interest was.
When you say you made mistakes, what mistakes did you make?
Well, for example, there's the warehousing for the Napa Valley wines are off a place called American Road. Off I-80. We had excluded that from the same district as the wineries. And they said, no, because the warehousing for the wines was such an integral part of the wine industry, they were community of interest, and they should be put together. So we redrew the lines. That's just a good example.
Yeah, that's a good example.
And we would never pick that up on our own.
So what about political parties, or the political party of the incumbent, or the political orientation of a particular area? Was that a consideration?
No, by law, we were not allowed to consider where incumbents lived or the registration in the district. It was to be a non-political process to the extent we could make it that way. And to the extent we couldn't talk to the legislature, and they couldn't talk to us. I had a friend of mine, Lois Welk, who's a state senator, and I served on the city council with her in Davis. I mean, we laughed. It's like, can we say hello to each other? I mean,
it was a bright line.
It was a bright line, a very bright line.
Okay. What about making districts more competitive? Was that one of the goals of the process?
No, it wasn't officially one of the goals, but the practical matter is that when you no longer favor the incumbents, you make the districts more competitive. And there was a big turnover in the legislature and in Congress in the 2012 election. And in fact, I was reading a report just this morning, and I went getting ready for this meeting, that fully 9 of California's congressional districts became competitive from where they were not competitive in the past. And that's quite a bit, actually.
Yeah, and it sounds like a small amount, but actually, if you take a look at congressional districts, there's virtually no turnover historically.
There had been historically, something like, there were over between 2000 and 2010, there was something like 760 elections for various state offices. And it's like 5 turned over.
Wow, that's amazing.
It just didn't happen.
The other thing you mentioned was federal laws that you were required to follow. What exactly did you have to follow there?
Well, the main one we had to follow, besides the constitutional requirements, was the Voting Rights Act. And Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act basically says you can't either pack or crack districts. And what that means, you can't put all of a particular ethnic group into one and so dilute their ability to affect other districts. And likewise, you can't dilute them so much that they don't have the ability to elect members of their ethnicity.
Well, that's quite a balancing act. Well,
it was very much so.
Well, I want to thank you for the overview of the Citizens Redistricting Commission. When we come back, we'll talk about the case before the U.S. Supreme Court that may overturn the work of the California Citizens Redistricting Commission. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. California's redistricting efforts over the last 5 years may all be for naught if the U.S. Supreme Court overturns a similar measure passed in Arizona. We're talking to California Citizens Redistricting Commissioner Stanley Forbes. So it appears at the heart of the Arizona case is the election clause of the Constitution, which states that, quote, the times, places, and manner of holding elections for Congress shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. So it sounds like the key question is, what's a legislature? Does that include voters via the initiative process?
Well, those of us in California certainly think it does. That was the essence of the brief that we filed with the Supreme Court as an amicus brief. Those who are strict constructionists may take the view that legislature meant the people who sit in the chairs as of 1787, and that's all it is. But I'd like to think that the initiative process and the referendum process of the public has become part of the legislative process. Our view would be that it's really talking about the legislative power, not so much the physical legislature.
Well, you think about the legislative process. We've had initiatives and referendums for some time, and not just in California, in a lot of states.
A lot of states.
And the other issue I think would be is governors have a role to play in the legislative process. They veto bills.
And actually, so do the courts.
Yeah, and the courts do as well. So
exactly.
And one of the interesting questions that I've read is that some people are saying, well, if the court rules against the Arizona Redistricting Commission, that will mean that, ironically, that the courts cannot be involved in this decision making at all.
Exactly. I mean, it would be very interesting. You could cut out the governors and the courts, and only the legislature would do it, and maybe if they couldn't do it, what happens then?
Right.
Because there's no referee.
Right.
It's a very interesting.
And then you couldn't challenge, if it was gerrymandered, you couldn't challenge it in the courts because the courts have no right to hear it. It's only the legislature, and it becomes, you know, kind of tautological in a way.
It is.
Well, let me ask you this. You know, there's an argument that, you know, you guys were not elected, and at least legislators are elected and responsible to the voters, or responsive to the voters. What's your argument?
Well, I think there's a couple. First of all, I would argue that in a sense we were elected because the public passed this. The public has a referendum power to undo what we do. So, and there are many instances where the legislative body, typically the legislature, but not always, it could always be the public, create bodies to make important policy decisions, and they delegate the power. And in that sense, I think we've been delegated the power by the public. And so I don't think that's a valid argument. The other thing, I think, even if you accept the argument at face value, you have a choice. You can have the lines drawn by a politician who have a vested interest and it's very undemocratic, or you can have a body draw the lines that has no stake in this at all and end up with a much more democratic result.
More neutral.
More
I think
neutral,
you would
exactly,
say, certainly.
Precisely.
So what happens to the California Redistricting Commission's efforts if the Supreme Court overturns the Arizona initiative process? What would happen to your lines?
Well, it's a very interesting question. Remember, this only deals with the congressional lines. It does not deal with the state legislature at all. This is just congressional.
Okay, so you could have a situation where the state lines you draw, they stay intact, in place, but the congressional lines now change.
Exactly, that's possible. Now, it really depends what the court says. But I mean, I can only speculate. The legislature, I think, in their wisdom, could simply say, we endorse these lines. They've been very well received. The process was supported by the public. The courts talked about it being fair, unbiased, transparent. They could simply basically agree, yes, that's true, we're going to hold these in place.
Or they could tweak it.
Well, it's interesting, and I think and we spent $10 million on this, we spent 5 years, only 5 years away from the next census, and I think you really have to go to ask them, if they're going to change the lines, why? What's the motive for changing the line? And to me, I think they expose themselves, excuse me, to the issue of, here are the politicians mucking it up again and getting back into where they're going to protect their interests as opposed to the public's. And so the politicians may not want to go anywhere. And that's why I suggested that, or think that maybe just ratifying them might be the way to go, certainly until the next census.
Okay, well, I want to thank California Citizens Redistricting Commissioner Stanley Forbes, for joining us. When we come back, we'll talk to veteran Capitol observer John Myers and get his take on the pending court decision and what it might mean for California's congressional districts. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome. If Arizona's and by implication California's redistricting efforts are rejected by the court, what's next? We're now joined by KQED's senior editor on California politics and government, John Myers. Welcome back to the Maddy Report, John.
Always happy to be here.
Well, this is a big decision in front of the court with California implications. You've said that U.S. Supreme Court and California native, by the way, Anthony Kennedy, is a likely swing vote. Yeah. So how's he likely to swing, and what do you think the court's going to rule?
Anthony Kennedy's always a swing vote at the court, right? I mean, any issue that comes up, and I think this one is an important one. But I think it's really interesting, Mark, if we step back and we talk about what the case, just a quick thumb sketch of what this case is about. You know, the fundamental question here is whether or not voters have the power to act as a legislature. We know in California and states in the West, primarily direct democracy, we've given voters that power. That's not everywhere across the country. And the U.S. Constitution talks about the role over elections for Congress being controlled by a legislature. And so the Arizona legislature says, hey, we're the only ones that are legislators. And that's the crux of the case, because the Arizona system and the California system, both created by the voters using their power to write laws. If the Arizona case crumbles, we think the California Commission and the California process could be next. And yeah, Anthony Kennedy is this guy in the middle. He asked questions that did not make it clear which way he was going to fall in this when it was heard last month back in Washington. We expect the court to rule in June. And Kennedy, I think, is a great story because he's a Californian. He's a native of Sacramento. He actually wrote a ballot measure, you know, for Ronald Reagan back in the 70s, a tax measure. He understands the initiative process. But I think he probably holds the fate of the Arizona and, by extension, the California commissions in his hands as to whether or not they are constitutional and whether voters can control these races for Congress and these maps for Congress or not.
It sounds like he might be going, you're thinking he might be going in favor of keeping the Citizens Redistricting
It's
Commission?
hard to tell. I've talked to a few lawyers around the Capitol. They all have their partisan hats when we talk unofficially on. But there is this sense that the Arizona Commission could be stricken down, in which case, in short order, someone would say the California Commission and those independently drawn congressional maps are illegal.
Well, let's say the court does strike down the Arizona Redistricting Commission, by implication California's. What would happen in California?
Well, great question. We're totally uncharted territory. I think in short order, someone would ask the question whether the California districts are legal, you know, the independent commission having drawn them. You would think that they would not be. In which case, what do you do with a 2016 election breathing down your neck? And there are really two problems, I think, Mark. One of them is timing. How fast could you draw new congressional districts in California? And two is, could you draw them fairly? Remember that congressional districts are drawn with census data. That census data is from 2010. That data is old, in which case we don't know the populations for sure of the districts. We don't necessarily know the makeup of the districts. Someone could easily say, you know, it's not one person, one vote, which is the standard for congressional districts. It's a mess.
So possibly 2016, but that sounds a little unlikely given all the things that have to happen.
Well, but someone could also argue that if the High Court has said that the districts were drawn illegally, you can't have another election with those districts. I mean, really, when you talk to people who know this kind of stuff, you're talking a matter of weeks that someone would have to get up and running to convene a system, to draw maps, to go through a process. Remember that people can start declaring for office in 2016. In late 2015, the court's not going to rule until the end of June, perhaps. That's a crazy short timeline.
Right, right. You know, it's interesting that the court's decision invalidating the Arizona Redistricting Commission could have implications for other good government provisions in California, like the top two primary, couldn't it?
Well, it's a U.S. constitutional question about drawing about the role of our congressional elections. I mean, I think that people want to challenge a number of these changes that we've put in place in California. The really interesting part, if I could mention it, Mark, is that this is only congressional maps, not the maps for the legislature. So you would still have an independent commission that could draw, and again, we have to tell people this is only theory, but we could have an independent commission drawing districts for the state, Senate, and Assembly, and the legislature drawing districts for Congress. We would have this very strange, mixed-up system if the court case moves that way.
So let's assume it happens.
Yeah.
If it doesn't happen, we don't have to worry.
Doesn't happen, we'll just call the show off. We're done.
Right.
Yeah.
But if it does happen, what congressmen do you think are particularly vulnerable?
Well, I think there are two ways to look at that. One of them is to look at if you draw the districts "quote unquote" fairly, and one way is to look if you draw them with a partisan intent. Because remember, if the districts are redrawn in California, they'll be drawn by the legislature, which is controlled by Democrats. Right. If they're drawn fairly and you're dealing with issues of populations and ethnicity, you've got real questions about Los Angeles because there's a very complicated mix there, African American, Latino communities, and populations that could really shift those congressional districts. If you're looking at it as a partisan intent, let's just throw out the crazy scenario. If you're Democrats, do you want Kevin McCarthy, the majority leader of the House of Representatives, to continue to have a safe seat in Bakersfield? Maybe not. Now, maybe you can't actually completely put a Democrat in there, but maybe you could carve him into the district near him with Devin Nunes, the Republican congressman there.
Who's chair of the Intelligence Committee.
Yeah, but if you're going to pick one, you probably want to knock off the guy who's the majority leader in Congress.
Right, so a lot of implications there.
Who knows?
There are other races that were very close. Jim Costa in the Valley, a Democrat, had a very close election.
And if you're Democrats, maybe you want to help his district. You want to make it a little more Democratic friendly. There are all kinds of ways you could play it in a partisan view.
Okay. Well, up next, has taking redistricting out of the hands of the legislature and giving it to an independent commission really made a difference? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with KQED's senior editor on California politics and government, John Myers, about a Supreme Court decision that may end up threatening California's redistricting reform effort. So theoretically, removing gerrymandering from the redistricting process was supposed to make races more competitive, did it?
Hard to define. I mean, I wish there was a yes or no answer out of this.
That was a pregnant pause.
Well, it's because it's a complicated issue. I don't think there's anyone in California who thinks that districts were drawn totally without partisan politics in mind in the past. And we have a real checkered past in California, the way the political districts were drawn. The courts had to step in the 90s, had to step in the 70s. There was an effort to overturn them in the 80s on the ballot. I mean, it was a mess. So I think that if you I think if anything you take away from the districts that were drawn, you can say that they were drawn without partisan politics in mind. The commission actually didn't even look at party registration when they drew those congressional and legislative districts. I think that has made a few seats more competitive. I think that if you look in some places in Northern California, outside of Sacramento, there was a congressional race that I think is more competitive under the new district. I think that some of those Los Angeles districts were a little bit more competitive. Inland Empire, a couple of places, and certainly in Fresno, Jim Costa and Johnny Teixeira went down to a handful of votes there. I think in part because the district may look a little bit different than it used to, but those are on the margins. I think people who thought that they were going to get this unbelievably competitive map in a state like California that is primarily Democratic, they were dreaming, and we didn't get that.
Well, proponents were also basically talking about all the benefits of a Citizens Redistricting Commission on the legislative process. They were saying, you know, it was going to increase compromise, reduce gridlock, get rid of political polarization, all these kind of
Those
wonderful
are all
benefits.
the ballot arguments, right?
Right.
That you're trying to sell the measure with, right?
So did they oversell?
Yeah, they oversold. I mean, I don't know a ballot measure that hasn't been oversold in some way, shape, or form, both in doom or gloom in the last several years. I think that this was incremental change, and it was redistricting, and it was the top two primary system that changed the primary rules, and it was longer term limits that we passed in 2012, and all of these things are little incremental changes to try to make the process somewhat better. I mean, no, we haven't seen necessarily less partisanship. We certainly haven't seen it in Washington from the congressional districts. And I don't think we've seen it in Sacramento because of redistricting. If anything, what we've seen different in Sacramento is that the one thing we fought over the most, a state budget, we don't fight over anymore because it only takes Democrats to pass it. But I do think that the changes made progress toward a different kind of system, but it takes years.
Incremental.
Yeah.
Incremental progress. Well, what about the unintended consequences? You know, we pass these initiatives, and a lot of times we don't think of the unintended consequences. Were there any here?
For redistricting in particular?
Redistricting, yeah.
I think that, you know, that people, redistricting is an arcane subject, you know, and I'm thankful to the audience to listening this far into our conversation. It only happens once every 10 years. And when people think of gerrymandering, they think of scraggly, drawn districts and maps that don't look, you know, compact or reasonable.
Gerrymandering comes from Salamander. It was Governor
Elbridge Gerry, governor of Massachusetts,
right,
who drew his own kind of salamander-esque
like a salamander, yeah,
district. You did your homework, but so I think that I don't know if there's an unintended consequence, but I don't think that people really understood what redrawing these maps were going to look like. And we talked about Los Angeles in a moment. There is a big cultural, generational shift in Los Angeles between, again, African-American communities, Latino communities, Asian-American communities. There are people who will lose power under independent redistricting out of that because power will change, because those communities are changing. And I don't think voters quite understood that or would have seen that as part of changing the process.
And to put a fine point on it, that's where the votes are in Southern California. So it's very impactful for the state, for Sacramento, and also.
And it's really hard to draw districts in Los Angeles. I tried to do it with a computer one time. I mean, and I broke every constitutional rule trying to figure out a way to put that puzzle together.
Your computer started smoking.
Almost.
Okay. So, you know, the independent redistricting commissions in Arizona and California are both born out of the initiative process. And some think maybe the initiative process is perhaps the problem. You know, that maybe we have too many initiatives, or they're being driven by too few wealthy people that are putting these things on the ballot. Does that what needs to be changed, the initiative process, reformed in some way?
Well, it's a larger kind of complicated topic. I mean, I think that you know, we have talked about initiative reform, whatever that means, over the last several years. There were changes.
Say transparency.
Yeah, there were. Well, I was going to say there were changes put in place in 2014 by a bill that moved through the legislature. The governor signed into law, makes it a little different in how you get an initiative on the ballot. But the transparency about who's behind it, I mean, that's a campaign money issue in a lot of ways. And the other thing is how well are they drafted, and do they need to go back and be revisited? And even in redistricting, if I could just point that one out for a moment, we had two separate ballot measures, 2008, 2010. Right. In the 2010 measure about Congress, there was a phrase called communities of interest. Right. It said we want to keep communities of interest together in political districts. There's no definition of communities of interest. It's a subjective term. Is it the people who live in around your neighborhood, around a school? Is it people in a city? I think those are the kinds of things that voters think they are making a choice on in initiatives, and I don't know how you resolve that, because I mean, at a certain point, drafting these measures is complicated, and Californians love the initiative process. You may hate some of them, but you love your ability to go out and vote.
Right. Well, I want to thank KQED's John Myers and California Citizens Redistricting Commissioner Stanley Forbes for joining us. If you want to stay up to date in local politics and state politics, you can sign up for our free e-newsletter, The Maddy Daily, by logging on to our website at maddyinstitute.org. This is Mark Keppler for The Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us. The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.